Hello everyone, welcome to your lecture on patriarchy. This lecture is a part of your paper on gender, media and society. This lecture will help you understand the concept of patriarchy and the process through which it operates in society with special reference to India. Meaning of patriarchy. Patriarchy represents a social and cultural system in which all the material resources, for example land, cash, etc., are owned and controlled by the male head of the family, who also exercises control over all productive and even reproductive labor of women in the family. Patriarchy has been defined as a structure of societal edifices and implementations where men control, dominate and misuse women. Hartman opines it is a set of social relations between men which have a material base and which, though hierarchical, establish or create interdependence or solidarity among men that enable them to dominate women. In popular discourse, often the term matriarchy is loosely used as a counterposition to patriarchy. The standard anthropological definitions of patriarchy and matriarchy are based on the formulations of Radcliffe Brown. Brown states that a society is possibly patriarchal when parentage is patrilineal, that is, the children belong to the father or the family group of the father. Marriage is virilocal, that is, the wife proceeds to the native family of the husband. Birthright of possessions and accomplishment fall in the line of man, and the household is patripotestal, that is, command over the family members is controlled by the father or his relatives. Likewise, a matriarchal society is one where parentage, legacy and progression are in the line of female. Wedding is matrilocal, that is, moving of the husband to the household of the wife, and when right upon children is exercised by the relatives of the mother. Even in the matriarchal society, the dominance of the male continues in the sense that in such societies the maternal uncle or the male relative on the mother's side wield familial control. According to Radcliffe Brown, there are no empirical societies where women legitimately wield authority over men in the family and society. Thus, a matriarchal society is actually a myth. It would, however, not be misplaced to argue that the normalizing of patriarchal families as the prototypical and universal model have led to subversion of all other family systems, including the matriarchal societies. Public and private patriarchy. One of the most important contributions in theorizing and conceptualizing patriarchy has been made by Sylvia Walby. In doing so, she distinguished between public and private forms of patriarchy, suggesting that patriarchal relations outside the household are important in shaping the patriarchal relations within it. Family as an institution is not based on the principles of equity. Power dynamics remain ingrained in different forms, covert and overt, across different layers of relationships fashioned by kinship rules, socio-cultural norms and historical processes. There are differences in endowments, resources, positioning and placement within the domestic unit. duties and responsibilities as per age, sex and position. Given these factors, each individual has varying ownership or access to control of spaces, physical, economic, socio-cultural and political, which further determines the levels of empowerment, placement of a member in intra-household power hierarchies and bargaining capacities. Given this scheme of things, place of a woman in the household is sculpted by the patriarchal ideologies which decrease biased allocation of resources in favor of men, devaluing the work women do, both unpaid work undertaken at home as well as the paid work they undertake in the labor market, patrilineal lineage system, stringent gendered socio-cultural norms and restrictive religious codes. While in private sphere, women are subjected to individual and direct appropriation by the family members. In public space, women experience collective appropriation, whereby they are segregated in the lower levels of occupational hierarchy in the workplaces, as men dominate powerful positions, making policies and exercising their control over women. As more women enter the public sphere in the pursuit of education and employment, they are likely to be subjected to patriarchal control. These 6 important patriarchal constructions are: male-controlled method of construction, male-controlled associations in salaried work, male-controlled associations in the state, male-controlled relationships in sexuality, male-controlled relations in ethnic organizations, and male violence as a patrilineal structure. In most of the societies in the world, men dominate as decision makers within families as well as in various public spaces. Such male domination surpasses the confines of the family and extends into the community, tribe or nation, affecting the public life and workplace. Thus, the economic, political and religious organizations are embedded in patriarchal ideologies where men are the decision makers and at the helm of affairs, while women are placed in the lowermost rungs of power hierarchy. In India, for example, political participation among women, both as leaders and cadres, is dismally low compared to men. Similarly, in the labor market, most of the women work in informal sector and even in the organized sector. They are mostly employed as low-level executives rather than as decision makers at the managerial levels. All the major political parties are patriarchal in the sense that barring a handful of women are headed by men. All religious organizations are also headed by men to an extent that at some places of worship, women are even debarred from entering. Walby observed that patriarchy operated in collusion with capitalism. She goes on to argue that the state should be seen as both patriarchal and capitalist, since the state endorses patriarchal relations through different methods like restricting paid work accessibility to women, low work participation rate among women in non-home based paid work, especially among those hailing from upper caste and upper class groups, low wages paid to women for doing the same work as men, deployment of women into the labor market in times of economic crisis, followed by their withdrawal during periods of relative financial stabilization, segregation of occupation, etc. All these testify to the operations of public patriarchy at work, whereby women are viewed as secondary wage earners for the family. Earning money and providing for the family is the man's job. There has also been a clear-cut domination of men over technological know-how and expertise. Men are encouraged to study medicine, engineering, astronomy, mathematics, and politics. Women, on the other hand, are facilitated entry into the public world of work and politics, where these spheres are rendered as masculine. Social construction of femininity and masculinity. The easiest way to comprehend the notions of masculinity and femininity is to approach the two concepts from the viewpoint of what males and females do, that is, how they conduct themselves, instead of what they actually are. In this opinion, the masculine and the feminine indicate a variety of traditionally well-defined attributes which are allocated to both males and females. Mingling mediators like families, schools, and the media indoctrinate and confirm gender-suitable behavior. In the project of identifying masculine and feminine traits of gender identities, basically the biological differences are translated into socio-cultural attributes. Both masculinity and femininity are interactive ideas. One exists in opposition to the other. Both are built and replicated via individuals, implementation and manners in their daily lives. Masculinity does not merely signify male bodies but also denotes particular attributes, behaviors, practices, etc., which can be embraced by anyone. According to Connell, masculinity is not a monolithic construct. Rather, there are multiple masculinities located in different social contexts. A very relevant incident in point is the demotion of gay males by heterosexual males, which not only reflects differing levels of power among these different forms of masculinities, but also a conflation of subordinate masculinities with femininity. Connell and Messerschmitt also talk about dominating masculinity as an overriding form of masculinity which embodies heterosexual, white, middle-class men in Western cultures. On the other hand, femininity is associated with femaleness and not merely adhered to any specific body. Scholars have contended that there shall not be hegemonic femininity in any form, as every femininities are created as subsidiary to masculinities, especially dominating masculinities. However, Connell put forth the idea of emphasized femininity as a highlighted method of femininity, distinguished by its domination by masculinity, that is a vital constituent in men's authority upon women in the gender affairs. Nevertheless, these multiple layers, masculinity in general embodies aggression, competitiveness, emotional inarticulateness, rationality, etc., while femininity is seen to embody emotions, tenderness, nurturing nature, etc. Under patriarchal systems, masculine traits are exalted while the feminine traits are devalued. Addressing men in patriarchies. The patriarchal system of hierarchical power relations is considered as the single most important factor behind subordinate status of women in the society. Despite the popular belief that associates patriarchy with women's subjugation and their call for liberation, men, as much as women, are negatively affected by patriarchy, a fact which is more often dismissed than accepted. Much of the theorizations pertaining to patriarchy and feminism project men as the all-powerful beings. However, such projections completely undermine the fact that such patriarchal ideologies also shape and inform masculine identities and their sense of self. Hooks employs the term imperialist white supremacist capitalist patriarchy to define interconnecting political structures that shape the principles of the politics of nations across the globe. Patriarchy is a political societal structure that declares that males are inherently superior to everything and everyone deemed weak, especially females, and endowed with the right to dominate and rule over the weak and to maintain that dominance through various forms of psychological terrorism and violence. John Bradshaw points out the dictionary defines patriarchy as a social organization marked by the supremacy of the father in the clan or family in both domestic and religious functions. He elucidates further that patriarchal rules still govern most of the world's religious school systems and family systems. According to him, among the most devastating patriarchal rules is that of blind obedience, the foundation upon which patriarchy stands. The repression of all emotions except fear, the destruction of individual willpower, and the repression of thinking whenever it departs from the authority figure's way of thinking. Children are socialized into patriarchal ideologies pertaining to masculinity and femininity from the time of their childhood. This is done through all such institutions as family, community, religion, education, etc., which compel them to consider these ideologies as normal and obvious ways of organizing social life. Gender roles are learned from the parents within the family in the first place. Right from the beginning, gender consciousness is reinforced in the child through the process of reward and punishment. The boys and girls are socialized to behave differently. Girls as subservient, soft-spoken, patient, nurturing and emotional, while boys as strong, aggressive, ambitious, competitive, strategic and rational. Expressing emotions freely is a matter of shame for a boy, while a highly encouraged attribute for a girl. To quote Hooks, to indoctrinate boys into the rules of patriarchy, we force them to feel pain and to deny their feelings. These approaches were, however, strengthened in educational and spiritual institutions. Real narrates the oppression of patriarchal culture in holding the men captive. Real uses the saying psychological patriarchy to define the patriarchal discernment collective to women and men. Although feminist thinkers have pointed out that a patriarch may not necessarily be a man, but can also be a woman, but most thinkers tend to lose sight of this established fact. They endure to consider males as the cause of problem for patriarchy. However, we need to recognize that females play a significant part in preserving and supporting patriarchal tradition, even though males acquire more recompenses from that structure. There are two perspectives from which the victims of patriarchy could be viewed. One, that men oppress women, and second, that patriarchy and sex roles hurt both men and women. Both these realities coexist. As pointed out by Hooks, the fact that males are also offended by stiff sex roles does not render male oppression of women any less undesirable, nor does it lessen male responsibility for supporting and perpetuating their power under patriarchy to exploit and oppress women in a manner far more grievous than the serious psychological stress and emotional pain caused by male conformity to rigid sexist role patterns. Thus, the operation of patriarchy needs to be viewed as perverse, expression of power, generic lack of authority upon one's own action, emotive powerlessness, and widespread illogicality, even amounting to the extreme insanity, rather than as a unidirectional act of powerful men dominating women. Men internalize these sexist ideologies unconsciously as part of their formation of masculine identities, and they come to equate manliness to ferocious dominance and exploitation of women with advantage. Given that it is never possible for them to understand the damage they cause to themselves and others to quench their learned manly aggression so dearly instilled in them and nurtured by the society. Patriarchy as a system has denied males access to full emotional well-being, which is not the same as feeling rewarded, successful, or powerful because of one's capacity to assert control over others. Researchers on crimes committed against women have repeatedly pointed out that much of the violence is actually an expression of patriarchal backlash. It is an effort to remind women that their legitimate place in the society is within the Lakshman Rekha. Any act of transgression of this socially approved line of legitimacy ought to render the women as lascivious, loose, and promiscuous, and such women must be reminded of their appropriate place in the society through violent counteroffense. Naturally, the men, being the perpetrators of heinous crimes such as rape, molestation, acid attack, etc., are scornfully resented by the society. However, Hooks argues, and rightfully so, that the catastrophe facing male is a crisis of patriarchal masculinity and not catastrophe of masculinity. In her own words, until we make this distinction clear, men will continue to fear that any critic of patriarchy represents a threat. In this context, therapist Terence Real distinguishes between political patriarchy and psychological patriarchy. While the former refers a commitment towards ending sexism, the latter refers to dynamic interaction between the masculine and feminine qualities, whereby the supremacy of one half of the human traits are established at the expense of the other half, which is devalued. Both men and women participate in this complex pursuit of power domination, submission, manipulation, and collusion. Hooks observed that in order to put an end to patriarchal exploitation of both men and women, we must challenge both the concrete political manifestation as well as covered psychological undertones in daily life. Summing up this lecture, we learn that patriarchy is a social institution which establishes the primacy of men over women, allowing the former to dominate and control the latter. It underscores the production and maintenance of stereotypical masculine and feminine identities. The former is necessarily privileged at the expense of the latter. Socialization processes operating through family, schools, and media serve to reiterate these gender stereotypes since childhood. However, one of the most misplaced beliefs is to assume that the patriarchal ideologies marginalize women only and are utterly rewarding for men. Several scholars argue that such ideologies are as much detrimental to men as women. In order to overthrow these hierarchical oppressive structure, both men and women need to join hands together and work for the development of a gender-sensitive society. Hope you enjoyed the lecture. For more details, please read the e-text of this lecture properly and attempt the questions in the end. Thank you.